Imagine looking at the composite sketch of a cold-blooded killer, only to realize he sits directly behind your family in church every single Sunday. Even worse, imagine realizing his mother is the one who routinely drives you to those very services. This is the terrifying reality of a case where a simple country road turned into a hunting ground on a literal Friday the 13th. I'm your host, and today we are uncovering a nightmare that paralyzed the quiet town of Lake Brownwood, Texas, for 18 long months. This is the story of Rhonda Chantay Blankinship, a case that defied traditional police work, terrified an entire county, and ended with a shocking confession inside a packed sanctuary. Chantay was a 25-year-old woman who lived a highly structured, quiet life with her grandfather, Charlie Barnett. Diagnosed with a pervasive developmental disorder, she was incredibly vulnerable, standing under 5 feet tall and weighing just 89 pounds. Yet she was a bright light in her community, deeply loved for singing in her local church choir. Every single evening at sunset, Chantay took a routine walk down her neighborhood road. On the evening of May 13, 2016, she reached the community mailboxes and called her grandfather to let him know she was heading back. She hung up the phone, stepped into the twilight, and completely vanished. Because of her profound vulnerability, the Brown County Sheriff's Office immediately bypassed the standard waiting periods and launched an urgent, full-scale search. Little did they know, they were tracking a phantom who was hiding in plain sight. The search for Chantay Blankinship consumed the community over the next 48 hours, drawing in law enforcement officers, search dogs, and a massive grid of local volunteers who refused to give up hope. 2 days after her initial disappearance, on May 15, 2016, the search effort shifted toward an isolated, rural property located approximately 5 miles away from the community mailboxes, where Chantay had made her final phone call. This property was home to an abandoned, decaying Victorian farmhouse. Among local teenagers and young adults in the Brown County area, this eerie, forgotten structure was widely known by a singular, ominous nickname, the Haunted House. It was a place where local youth frequently gathered away from the eyes of adults, a dead space surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusted metal gates. As the search volunteers cautiously approached the perimeter of the property, the atmosphere grew heavy. Near the rusty front gate of the farmhouse property, a volunteer spotted something out of place in the dirt. Upon closer inspection, they discovered a distinct clump of hair alongside a brightly colored rubber bracelet. The family immediately recognized the bracelet as belonging to Chantay. The volunteers knew they were no longer just searching an open field. They were following a physical trail of a crime. They carefully tracked the signs of disturbance through the overgrown yard, moving past the decaying facade of the Victorian home toward a concrete storm cellar built into the ground. The heavy door was pushed aside, revealing a pitch-black staircase leading down into the subterranean darkness. Bypassing the shadow, searchers peered down into the cellar with flashlights. There, at the bottom of the concrete stairs, they made a horrific, stomach-turning discovery. They found Chantay's body. The 25-year-old woman was wearing only a t-shirt, and her remains were heavily covered in blood. The urgent missing persons search had instantly transformed into a brutal homicide investigation, sending shockwaves through the entire rural Texas county. When the forensic teams and the medical examiner arrived at the concrete storm cellar, the physical scene they documented was incredibly grim. The body was recovered and transported for a formal autopsy, and the subsequent forensic report revealed a crime of unimaginable savagery. The data showed that Chantay had been subjected to a brutal, deeply personal, and prolonged physical attack. The killer had not used a firearm or a sophisticated weapon. Instead, they had utilized the discarded objects of the immediate environment to execute the homicide. The medical examiner documented that the perpetrator had severely beaten Chantay across her head, her face, and her neck. The weapon used in this blunt force assault was a heavy, rusty metal lawnmower blade that investigators discovered discarded directly at the scene of the crime. The sheer force required to inflict these injuries with a lawnmower blade demonstrated an intense, uncontrolled rage. But the physical trauma did not stop with the blunt force weapon. The autopsy further revealed that Chantay had been severely strangled, cutting off her ability to breathe or cry out for help. Furthermore, the killer had violently stomped on her tiny body. The force of this action was so severe that it left a distinct, undeniable shoe print compressed directly onto her chest, providing the forensic teams with a critical piece of physical evidence regarding the tread and size of the killer's footwear. To conclude this sequence of horrors, the medical examiner confirmed that Chantay had also been severely sexually assaulted during the encounter. The details painted a picture of absolute depravity. An 89-pound, intellectually disabled woman completely overpowered and destroyed by a ruthless predator who left her body at the bottom of a dark concrete staircase. Detectives collected the suspect DNA profile from the scene, entirely confident that modern forensics would quickly give them the name of the monster. Armed with the horrific findings of the autopsy and the physical evidence gathered from the abandoned Victorian farmhouse, the Brown County Sheriff's Office went to work. For nearly 18 months, the department worked tirelessly, treating the case with absolute, unyielding urgency. They knew that a killer capable of such violence posed an immediate threat to every family in Lake Brownwood. This initial phase of the investigation provides an incredible amount of tension because the suspect pool built by the detectives was massive, yet it continually yielded zero positive results. Detectives began their work by heavily and repeatedly interrogating the people who were closest to Chantay. In domestic homicides, the perpetrator is statistically often found within the immediate social network, so investigators focused intense pressure on her inner circle. Chantay's boyfriend was brought into the interrogation room, questioned extensively about his movements, his relationship details, and his feelings toward Chantay. The detectives didn't stop there. Family members and immediate neighbors were questioned repeatedly as well. Every single alibi provided by these individuals was rigorously, aggressively vetted by independent investigators. Alibi logs, phone records, and physical movements were checked frame by frame and hour by hour. Detectives spent weeks trying to find a single crack in the stories of the people who loved Chantay, desperate for a breakthrough. But as the days rolled into weeks, the inner circle remained entirely clear. The boyfriend's alibi held up under intense scrutiny, the family members were demonstrably elsewhere, and the neighbors had no connection to the violence. The inner circle yielded nothing but grief, forcing the sheriff's office to cast a much wider net into the darker corners of the local community. When the immediate family and social network were completely ruled out, detectives turned their full attention to the geography of the crime scene itself. The abandoned Victorian farmhouse where Chantay's body was recovered wasn't a random location. It was a notorious local party spot for teenagers and young adults throughout Brown County. It was a place where youth went to drink, break laws, and escape supervision, which meant the killer could easily be someone who frequented the property for recreational purposes. Investigators began the monumental task of tracking down and interrogating dozens of local youths who were known to frequent the haunted house. This phase of the investigation was incredibly tedious, requiring detectives to parse through teenage rumors, social media check-ins, and late-night party logs. They interviewed high school students, college dropouts, and local young adults, asking the same burning questions. Was there a party that went horribly wrong on the night of Friday, May 13? Did someone bring Chantay to the property under false pretenses? Had anyone talked about luring a vulnerable woman to the storm cellar? Detectives floated various theories, wondering if a group of teenagers had committed the act as part of a twisted game, or if an individual had used the property's isolating reputation to conceal an ambush. Dozens of young men were brought in, their phone locations mapped, and their relationships analyzed. Yet, despite the high-pressure environments of the interrogation rooms and the extensive interviews, the teenage party crowd yielded no solid suspects. The youths were certainly guilty of trespassing and minor delinquency, but none of them exhibited the dark profile of a calculated killer who would use a lawnmower blade to end a life. The farmhouse crowd was a dead end, leaving investigators with a massive list of names but no closer to the truth. As the months continued to pass without an arrest, the Brown County Sheriff's Office initiated a massive community-wide DNA swabbing campaign. They were determined to run down every single community lead, no matter how minor or far-fetched it seemed. Police conducted hundreds of formal interviews across the state, and during this process, they formally swabbed multiple local men for DNA comparison. They took these genetic samples and ran them directly against the suspect profile that had been recovered from the crime scene and the victim's body. But the investigation quickly hit a solid wall of dead ends. Despite months of high-pressure interrogations, late-night raids, and extensive lab processing, the case ground to a complete and total halt. Every single lead they followed collapsed into nothingness. The DNA collected from the local men didn't match the suspect profile found at the scene, not even a little bit. This complete lack of progress triggered a wave of intense community panic throughout Lake Brownwood. Because there was no suspect in custody and no public answers, families began to isolate themselves entirely out of pure, unadulterated fear. People locked doors that had stayed open for decades. Parents refused to let their children play outside, and an atmosphere of paranoia settled over the county. The collective belief was that a hyper-violent killer was actively walking among them, sitting next to them at grocery stores or gas stations. And the most terrifying part of this entire 18-month period, they were completely right. The killer was walking among them, but he was completely off the police radar. A man named Ryan Derek Riggs, who was just 21 years old at the time, had never been named by a tipster, had never been brought into an interrogation room, and was completely unknown to the active investigation team. By late 2007, the traditional methods of policing had completely failed to solve the murder of Chantay Blankinship. The case files were thick. The DNA database searches returned 0 matches, and the community's fear had turned into a dull, permanent ache. Recognizing that they needed a revolutionary approach to break the gridlock, the Brown County Sheriff's Office turned to a cutting-edge technological firm called Parabon Nanolabs. They wanted to utilize an advanced genetic technique known as DNA phenotyping, specifically a service called Snapshot. To understand the power of this technology, you have to understand how it differs from standard forensic matching. Traditional DNA analysis requires a direct match. You take a suspect's swab and compare it to the crime scene sample, or you look for a match within a pre-existing database of convicted offenders. If the killer has never been arrested, the database is useless. DNA phenotyping completely flips the script. Instead of searching for a name, the technology reads the specific genetic markers within the crime scene DNA profile to scientifically predict a suspect's precise physical traits. It analyzes the code for eye color, hair color, skin pigmentation, facial structure, and even geographic ancestry. Parabon Nanolabs processed the DNA from the concrete storm cellar and constructed a biological portrait of the killer. On November 8, 2017, the Brown County Sheriff's Office released a computer-generated composite sketch to the public. The image depicted a young, fair-skinned Caucasian male with light eyes and short brown hair. The department's explicit intent was to flood the media, jog the community's collective memory, and drastically narrow the suspect pool. They wanted people to look at the sketch and think about the young men in their lives who fit that exact description. The digital image blast went live across Texas, entirely altering the psychological landscape of the investigation. The release of the computer-generated composite sketch hit Lake Brownwood like a thunderbolt. But the true impact of this genomic breakthrough wasn't felt in an interrogation room. It was felt within the sacred spaces of the local community. When the media blast flooded the news feeds, the internet, and local television screens, Chantay's brother sat looking at the image. A wave of immediate recognition washed over him. He didn't see a drifting stranger or a mythical monster. He instantly recognized the sketch as a specific kid who used to bully him relentlessly during their school years. That kid was Ryan Derek Riggs. The shocking proximity of the killer was absolute. Ryan Riggs wasn't a traveler passing through the county on Friday the 13th. He was a 21-year-old fellow church parishioner, an acquaintance of the Blankinship family, and a regular presence in their lives. In fact, the reality was deeply unsettling. Ryan Riggs sat directly behind Chantay Blankinship in church every single Sunday. While the community was panicking and locking their doors, Riggs was sitting in the pews, listening to the choir, and looking at the back of the family's heads. The connection went even deeper into the fabric of daily life. Riggs's own mother was a close acquaintance of the family, and she routinely picked Chantay up from her home to drive her to the church services. The family had invited this network into their lives, completely unaware that the son of the woman driving the car was the individual who had stalked Chantay to the mailboxes. The genomic sketch had pulled the mask off a wolf hiding in plain sight, and as the image continued to circulate through the community, the psychological pressure on Ryan Riggs began to mount to an unsustainable level. The psychological weight of the Parabon Nanolab sketch, combined with the sudden realization that the DNA timeline was rapidly closing in on him, completely broke Ryan Derek Riggs in a way that no police interrogation room ever could. On Wednesday night, November 15, 2017, just 1 week after the computer-generated image had flooded the local media, the North Lake Community Church gathered for a routine midweek prayer service. The sanctuary was quiet, filled with parishioners seeking comfort and spiritual guidance amidst the ongoing community tension. As the service progressed, Ryan Riggs walked through the doors. He was completely overwhelmed by a crushing sense of guilt and spiritual terror. In the middle of the service, before the entire gathered congregation, the 21-year-old man stood up. The room went silent as Riggs began to speak, openly and explicitly confessing to the brutal murder of Chantay Blankinship. The parishioners sat in absolute stunned disbelief as the young man who sat in their pews admitted to the savagery in the concrete storm cellar. In a bizarre attempt to explain the unexplainable, Riggs claimed to the congregation that he had committed the homicide because he had completely lost a spiritual battle to demons on the night of Friday the 13th. The scene that followed was purely cinematic. Stunned, horrified church members walked over to comfort the weeping killer, while other frantic parishioners quietly slipped out of the sanctuary to call the authorities. Brown County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the North Lake Community Church shortly after the call was placed. They stepped into the sanctuary, took Ryan Derek Riggs into custody without incident, and transported him directly to the station, where he sat down and recorded a full, formal, and legally binding confession detailing every aspect of the crime. With a full, recorded confession and an ironclad DNA match, the legal system in Texas moved swiftly to address the crime. Ryan Derek Riggs was formally indicted by a grand jury on capital murder charges, the highest homicide offense in the state of Texas. Because the crime involved kidnapping, sexual assault, and extreme physical cruelty inflicted on a vulnerable, disabled individual, the prosecution possessed the legal authority to pursue the death penalty. Facing the absolute certainty of a conviction and the very real prospect of facing the lethal injection gurney, Riggs chose to accept full liability for the crime. He entered into a negotiated plea deal, pleading guilty to the charges in exchange for his life. The final judicial reckoning was absolute. Ryan Derek Riggs was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In the Texas prison system, that sentence carries no loopholes. He will never be allowed to stand before a parole board. He will never receive a sentence reduction for good behavior, and he will die behind the walls of a state facility. As we stand here today in 2026, Ryan Riggs remains completely incarcerated inside a maximum security Texas state prison, serving out the quiet, isolated remainder of his life sentence. The case of Chantay Blankinship remains a hallmark text in modern forensic studies, frequently referenced in professional records, like the A2LA forensic DNA phenotyping case study, the TDCAA snapshot of a killer prosecutor record, and national CBS News Crime Watch reports. It stands as a profound testament to the power of genomic science to expose a predator who believed he was completely invisible. But more than the science, it is a reminder of a bright, innocent 25-year-old woman who loved to sing in the choir, whose memory will always be cherished by the community of Lake Brownwood. The shadow in the pew is gone, the concrete storm cellar is sealed, and justice has finally had the last word in the Lone Star State. If you found this deep dive into the legal and psychological layers of this case meaningful, please subscribe to the channel. Your support means a lot. Don't forget to hit the like button if you appreciate the effort that goes into uncovering these real-life cases. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and I'll see you in the next video.